I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now, and I've had my fair share of odd experiences on the road, but none of them, not even close, compare to what happened in 2017. It was a warm summer night, and I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, headed to a drop-off point in Arizona. The exact details of the load are foggy now, appliances, I think, but the memory of that night is as vivid as ever. The Mojave at night is pitch black. There's nothing around but open desert and an infinite expanse of stars above. On that night, my headlights were dimmer than they should have been. I'd been putting off getting them fixed as money was tight. Normally, the dim lights didn't bother me too much, but with so few cars on the road, the lack of visibility was glaringly obvious. I was straining my eyes to make out the faint outline of the road ahead, an endless stretch of black asphalt slicing through the vast nothingness. For hours, I debated pulling over to wait for sunrise. The thought of wasting time gnawed at me, though. I was behind on bills and needed every minute I could scrape together to get that paycheck. So, I kept driving, even though something deep inside me said it wasn't the smartest choice. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I first saw it. A faint shape up ahead in the middle of the road. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. My initial thought was that it might be an animal, and my heart jumped at the idea of hitting something out there. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt just short of a car parked dead center on the double yellow line. It was a red Ford Fusion, hazard lights blinking in rhythmic defiance of the desert's stillness. The passenger door was wide open, and the car itself looked untouched, as if someone had just walked away. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to help. After all, what kind of person leaves their car in the middle of the road like that? Curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I reversed my truck, pulled to the side of the road, and hopped out. The desert air was warm and still, unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the faint clicking of the car's hazards, sharp and insistent in the silence. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry asphalt. Something about the situation made my skin crawl. As I circled the car, the unease deepened. It was completely empty, not just of passengers but of any sign of life. The keys were in the ignition, but the engine was off. No bags, no personal items, nothing. Just the flashing hazards and that gaping open door. I looked around, scanning the desert, but there was nothing. The horizon stretched endlessly, shadows creeping along the edge of visibility. The back seat was as empty as the front, and when I tried the trunk, it wouldn't budge, locked. At this point, my brain was firing on all cylinders, each thought screaming that something wasn't right. Still, curiosity nagged at me. I grabbed the keys from the ignition and used them to pop the trunk. It took some effort, the damn thing seemed jammed, but eventually, it creaked open. Inside were 3 large garbage bags and a coil of thick, knotted rope. My breath caught. I'm not the kind of guy who panics easily, but something about those bags set my nerves on edge. The edges were taut, straining against their contents. Against all better judgment, I reached for one. My fingers were maybe an inch away when bang! The loudest gunshot I've ever heard ripped through the night. I jumped back, slamming my head against the roof of the car. Dazed and panicked, I flung the keys into the front seat and bolted back to my truck. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to get the door open. As I scrambled inside and slammed it shut, I heard a voice yelling, "Hey!" It was deep and raspy, with a threatening undertone that sent chills down my spine. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. "Hey, wait!" I turned the key and prayed my semi would start on the first try. It sputtered for a second before roaring to life. Relief washed over me as I threw it into gear. As I pulled away, I caught sight of him. He was short and stocky, with wild red hair and a scraggly beard. He wore dirty overalls and knee-high boots, and he was carrying a rifle in one hand and a small shovel in the other. Our eyes met for a moment. He didn't look angry, exactly. More desperate? But there was no way I was sticking around to find out what he wanted. I stepped on the gas, the truck lurching forward. As I passed him, he dropped the shovel and started waving his arms, yelling for me to stop. When I didn't, he sprinted back toward the car. I kept my eyes on him in the rearview mirror until the darkness swallowed him whole. My hands were trembling on the wheel as I sped down the highway. My mind raced with every horrible possibility of what I'd just seen. I'd barely driven 5 minutes when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Headlights. They were small and distant at first, but they were coming up fast. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tightly. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the headlights kept gaining. I reached for my phone and called the police, stumbling through an explanation of what had happened. The dispatcher's calm voice was no comfort. She told me to stay on the line, but the headlights were already right behind me, blinding in my mirrors. The horn blared, a long, aggressive note that made me flinch. My truck wasn't fast enough to outrun them, and soon the car was inches from my bumper. They kept honking and flashing their high beams, the lights stabbing into my eyes. My heart was pounding out of my chest, adrenaline flooding my veins. After what felt like an eternity, the car swerved into the next lane, pulling up beside me. I didn't dare look directly at them, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw the red Fusion. They veered in front of me, slamming on the brakes. I had to react fast to avoid a collision, my truck screeching as I fought to regain control. Just when I thought I was done for, blue and red lights lit up the horizon. Police cruisers sped toward us, sirens blaring. The Fusion swerved again, this time off the road entirely, disappearing into the desert. I pulled over, heart racing, as the officers approached. I spilled the whole story in a frantic rush, hoping they'd chase after the guy. But instead of taking off, the officer focused on questioning me. "We'll send a team to investigate," he said, clipboard in hand. "You just focus on getting to your destination." Frustration bubbled in my chest, but I didn't argue. What else could I do? They took my statement and sent me on my way. I drove for hours that morning, unable to shake the image of those garbage bags or the rifle-wielding man. To this day, I don't know what was in that trunk, and maybe that's for the best. Some of my buddies have their theories: dismembered bodies, evidence of a crime, something too horrifying to comprehend. I've told this story more times than I can count, and every time, the memories come flooding back. The oppressive darkness, the eerie silence, the desperate eyes of that man. I've made peace with never knowing the full truth, but one thing's for sure: I'll never drive through the Mojave at night again. My name is Kevin, and I've been a trucker for a variety of companies for the better part of 15 years. By now, things have become pretty routine for me. Pick up the goods, verify the load for accuracy, and deliver it as instructed. We're not paid by the hour, so efficiency is everything in this line of work. For someone like me who's been doing this forever, I've learned how to maximize my time and get more done in a single run than most. I'd like to think I can outwork all the young guns snapping up trucking jobs these days. That level of drive isn't always great, though. It means I often push myself to the absolute limit, functioning on barely any sleep and running on pure grit and adrenaline. Looking back, it's a miracle I didn't get myself into more accidents. But one particular night, or rather early morning in Montana, reminded me just how dangerous it can be when you push too hard. This happened about 4 years ago. I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For those unfamiliar, North Dakota is one of the flattest states in the US, which makes long-haul trucking a little easier. You don't have to deal with steep inclines or precarious mountain passes, which can be a godsend after hours behind the wheel. But it also tempts you to push beyond your limits. And I was guilty of doing that more often than I'd like to admit. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. Tuesdays meant more shipments needed to be sent out, which translated into more work for me. Eager to knock out the workload in one go, I planned a route through Montana and decided I'd drive straight through the night without stopping to sleep. It was an ambitious plan, but I figured if I managed my energy and timing right, I'd make my destination by early morning, around 3 a.m. The first few hours went smoothly. I'd hit the road not long after lunch and was making good time, cruising along the highways that seemed to stretch endlessly through the open plains. The scenery, vast expanses of farmland and rolling hills, had grown monotonous, the kind of view you don't even notice after years on the job. As the hours passed, I relied on little tricks to stay sharp, like rolling down the window for cold air or blasting my favorite classic rock playlist. But around midnight, I started to struggle. My eyelids felt heavier with each passing mile, and I had to keep rubbing the crust away just to stay focused. I remember looking at the clock, trying to reassure myself. "One more hour, Kevin," I muttered. You've got this. One trick I learned early in my trucking days was using smelling salts for an instant wake-up call. My buddy Tristan, another veteran trucker, had introduced me to them. He explained how just one sniff of those potent crystals could snap you back to attention. Don't overdo it though, he'd warned me. That stuff burns like hell and can mess you up if you're not careful. I reached for the little bottle stashed in the center console and gave it a hard shake before cracking it open. The sharp chemical smell hit my nostrils like a punch, and I jolted back, gasping as my senses heightened. My heart pounded as adrenaline coursed through me, and I hoped it'd last long enough to keep me going for the next stretch. But as the minutes ticked by, the effect started to wear off. I could feel myself slipping again, my vision blurring, and my grip on the wheel loosening. I snapped awake with a jolt as the truck drifted onto the shoulder, the rumble strips buzzing loudly under the tires. My pulse spiked with panic, and I realized just how dangerous this was getting. There was no way I could risk it any longer. I slowed down, scanning the roadside for a safe spot to pull over, but all I saw on either side of the highway was dense forest. I cursed under my breath, desperate for some kind of clearing or rest area. At this lower speed, my dim headlights cut deeper into the night, revealing the shadows of swaying tree branches and patches of overgrown grass. That's when I saw it. A purple dress was lying in the middle of the road. What the hell, I muttered, rubbing my eyes and blinking rapidly. Was I hallucinating? My exhaustion had to be playing tricks on me. But no, as I rolled closer, I could see the dress clearly. It was real. Something about the sight sent a shiver down my spine. My stomach knotted with unease, but I didn't stop. I drove past the dress, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just some random piece of discarded clothing. But less than 200 yards later, I spotted something else, a pair of shoes lying by the side of the road. This time, the dread was undeniable. "What the hell is going on?" I asked aloud, my voice shaking. The eerie randomness of it all made my skin crawl. My father, David, was a deeply religious man, and in that moment of uncertainty, I instinctively clutched the cross he'd left me when he passed. I whispered a quick prayer, hoping for strength and clarity. As I kept driving, my headlights illuminated more scattered clothing. This time, it wasn't just a single item. There were entire piles strewn about, a jacket, jeans, even what looked like small kids' clothes. My foot instinctively went to the brake. I had to stop. The truck came to a standstill, and I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I scanned the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, but curiosity and worry battled for dominance. Was someone in trouble? Could kids actually be out there, abandoned or hurt? I finally worked up the courage to step out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel as I approached the scattered clothing. The chilly May air cut through me, making my exhaustion temporarily fade. I crouched down to examine the pile and realized with a sinking feeling that these were definitely kids' clothes. Some pieces looked like they belonged to a boy, while others were clearly for a girl. The forest surrounding me felt alive with unseen eyes. I turned in every direction, trying to pierce through the darkness. My breath hitched when I heard it, a crunching sound, like twigs snapping underfoot, coming from the left side of the road. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just silence. Seconds later, another crunch came from the opposite side of the road. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I'd had enough. Every instinct screamed at me to get back to the truck and drive away, and I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted back to the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. As I fumbled to start the engine, a sound cut through the quiet night, a child's scream. It was high-pitched, panicked, and blood-curdling. My hands froze on the key in the ignition as I tried to process what I'd just heard. Another scream rang out, identical to the first. I was paralyzed by indecision. Part of me wanted to stay safe inside the cab and forget this nightmare, but the thought of helpless children being in danger twisted my gut into knots. Against my better judgment, I started the truck and turned the headlights to face the woods where the sound had come from. The beams illuminated the trees, cutting through the darkness just far enough for me to spot movement. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them, 3 or 4 shadowy figures. One of them was holding something large and rectangular. It took a second for my brain to register what it was, a speaker. They were using it to mimic the sound of screaming children. Before I could fully grasp what was happening, the figures ducked behind the trees, disappearing into the shadows. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, dialing. But just as I brought the phone to my ear, something heavy thudded against the side of the truck. I jumped, nearly dropping the phone. Another thud followed, this time on the opposite side. I was done. No more playing detective. I shoved the truck into gear and slammed my foot on the gas. As I sped off, I caught a glimpse of someone on the side of the road. They yelled something unintelligible and hurled another object at the truck. It struck the passenger side window, cracking the glass but not breaking it. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I just drove, my heart pounding like a drum. For the next hour, I was too shaken to think clearly. The forest-lined highway felt endless, every shadow and sound feeding my paranoia. When I finally reached my destination and completed the delivery, I collapsed in the sleeper cab of my truck, dead to the world. I must have slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the memory of that night came rushing back, hitting me like a freight train. My first call was to the police, who assured me they'd investigate the area. They promised to keep me updated, but I never heard back. To this day, I've never fully understood what happened that night. What were those people trying to do? Why didn't they just rush me when I stepped out of the truck? Were they planning to harm me, rob me, or worse? And who brings children's clothing and speakers to pull off such an elaborate trap? These questions have haunted me ever since. That stretch of highway now holds an eerie significance in my memory. In all my years on the road, I've never experienced anything quite as strange or downright terrifying as that night in Montana. One thing's for sure, exhaustion and curiosity can be a deadly mix, and I've learned to trust my instincts more than ever. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers document their routines and share tips for each other. Maybe you haven't. But as someone relatively young in this field, it's all over my social media feeds, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, you name it. Trucking influencers, as bizarre as that sounds, are a real thing. If you'd told me this 5 years ago, I would have laughed. But life has a way of taking you places you never expect, and here I am, a trucker with stories that'll put most of those viral clips to shame. I ended up in trucking somewhat unexpectedly. A few years back, I was enrolled at a fairly prestigious university. Life seemed on track. But things fell apart. Personal reasons, a cascade of setbacks, you get the idea. I dropped out and found myself needing a way to keep afloat. That's how I ended up behind the wheel of a semi. People tell me I could have been more than a trucker, and I get where they're coming from. But honestly, it's not a bad gig. Sure, the hours are brutal, but the money's decent if you're willing to put in the work. Besides, there's something about being on the open road that's freeing, at least most of them. That being said, there's a side to trucking most people don't talk about. It's not just the long hours or the monotony, it's the isolation. Spending countless hours alone gives your mind far too much room to wander. If you've got unresolved issues or lingering demons, they'll rise to the surface out there in the long, quiet stretches between destinations. That's what happened to me anyway. And, as it turns out, the loneliness of the job wasn't the only thing that could mess with your head. This particular incident happened about 3 months after I started my first trucking job. I was as green as they come, learning the ropes as I went. My route that night was from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a good 12-hour drive. That might not sound insane on its own, but factor in that I'd just completed another 8-hour trip before starting this one. And you'll get the picture. I'd barely had time to catch my breath before setting out again, and my goal was to make Lafayette by 3 a.m. to stay on schedule. It was ambitious, but I didn't want to mess up my record so early in my career. Things started out smoothly enough. The roads were quiet, almost eerily so, but that's pretty common for those late-night hauls. With no traffic to contend with, I was able to push my truck a bit faster than usual, nothing reckless, but enough to make decent time. Around halfway through the drive, though, fatigue started creeping in. I'd been relying on a stash of Red Bulls to keep me alert, but when I reached down to grab one, the stash was empty. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd forgotten to restock after my last run. For a moment, I considered pushing through, but the grogginess was hitting hard. I couldn't risk dozing off at the wheel, so I resigned myself to the inevitable. I had to stop. Glancing at my GPS, I spotted a service stop coming up and veered off the highway. As I pulled in, it became clear this wasn't your typical rest stop. Station. I found myself staring at what looked like an old, abandoned convenience store and a couple of boarded-up gas pumps. The entire place had an air of neglect, broken lights, cracked asphalt, weeds poking up through the pavement. Still, I didn't have many options. I parked the truck and climbed out, stretching my legs as I surveyed the dilapidated building. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. No cars, no people, just the faint rustle of the wind. The main convenience store looked as run down as the rest of the property, but I decided to check it out anyway. Either the door would be locked, or I'd find something salvageable. That's what I told myself. To my surprise, the door wasn't locked. It swung open with a faint creak, revealing a pitch-black interior. For a moment, I hesitated, peering into the darkness. Then I stepped inside. My boots crunched against the grimy tile floor as I moved cautiously forward, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. Just as I was about to turn back, a faint glow caught my attention from the far corner of the room. Curious, I made my way toward the light. It led me to a back room, where I found a refrigerator humming faintly against the wall. It was plugged in, inexplicably still running despite the otherwise lifeless state of the store. Eager for a caffeine fix, I opened the fridge, but it was empty. Not just empty, but stripped. No shelves, no drawers, nothing. Just a hollow shell. Disappointed, I closed the door, and that's when I heard it, a faint clatter coming from the main room. I froze. The sound had been subtle but unmistakable, something falling or perhaps being knocked over. My heart started pounding as I stood there, straining to listen. After a few seconds of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted something outside, or maybe my tired mind was playing tricks on me. Even so, I felt uneasy as I stepped back into the main room. It looked exactly as I'd left it, nothing out of place, no sign of movement. Still, my nerves were on edge. I'd had enough of this creepy detour, so I quickly made my way back to the truck. As I climbed into the cab, I took one last glance at the convenience store. My breath caught in my throat. The door, which I had definitely closed behind me, was now standing wide open. A chill ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and I didn't argue. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, merging back onto the highway as fast as I could. The caffeine from the drink I'd bought earlier began to kick in, but it did little to calm my nerves. My mind was racing, replaying the strange events of the past 20 minutes. What had opened that door? Could someone have been in there with me the whole time? As I drove, I tried to shake off the lingering unease, but it wasn't long before I noticed something else. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The faint swaying of the curtain separating the cab from the sleeper compartment. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't turned on the air conditioning, and there were no windows open. There was no logical reason for that curtain to be moving. A wave of fear washed over me. The thought that had been simmering in the back of my mind now came roaring to the forefront. Someone was in my truck. Trying to stay calm, I reached for my phone and discreetly punched in the location of the nearest police station. The GPS estimated a 20-minute drive. 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity, but I didn't have a choice. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. Every time I caught a hint of movement behind me, my heart raced. My imagination ran wild, picturing whoever or whatever might be hiding just a few feet away. Finally, the lights of the police station came into view. I pulled into the lot and stopped the truck as close to the building as I could. Practically leaping out of the cab, I ran inside and frantically explained the situation to the officers at the front desk. Within minutes, a group of cops surrounded my truck, weapons drawn. They signaled for me to unlock the sleeper compartment, and I obliged, my hands trembling as I handed over the key. What they found will haunt me for the rest of my life. Inside the sleeper compartment were 3 people, 2 men and a woman. They looked like they'd been living on the streets, their clothes tattered and filthy. One of the men clutched a pair of switchblades, and the other 2 had makeshift weapons made from sharpened metal scraps. Their eyes burned with a mix of anger and desperation as the officers pulled them out one by one and cuffed them. The entire time, they remained silent, glaring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When it was over, I tried to piece together how they'd gotten into my truck. The officers speculated they might have climbed in while I was inside the convenience store. Maybe they'd been planning to rob me, or maybe they just wanted a ride. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that their intentions had been far from harmless. The cops assured me the situation was under control, but their words did little to ease my mind. As I climbed back into the truck to complete my delivery, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. To this day, I don't know what those 3 people were planning, and honestly, I don't want to. All I know is that I came far too close to finding out. Since that night, I've been more vigilant than ever. I lock my truck religiously and avoid stopping anywhere that feels even remotely off. And though I've shared this story with a few friends and fellow truckers, the memory still sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes it's what's hiding in the shadows that truly haunts you. I've always liked the isolation of trucking. Some folks can't handle the endless stretches of road and empty landscapes, but for me, it's peaceful. It's just you, your rig, and the road. No one to deal with, nothing to distract you. You can get lost in your thoughts. At least, that's how it normally is. I was driving somewhere in the middle of Nevada on a deserted highway, no sign of life in any direction. It was one of those stretches of road where you could go hours without seeing another vehicle, let alone a town. Close to midnight, I started noticing something off with my rig. The engine made a faint sputtering noise, barely noticeable at first, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced at the dashboard. Nothing seemed wrong. No warning lights, no signs of trouble. But the noise persisted, a quiet, regular cough, as if the engine were struggling. I had another 2 hours before the next truck stop, and I figured I'd make it there before anything serious happened. At least, that's what I thought. About 20 minutes later, the sputtering turned into a full-on stutter. Then, the engine just died. The truck coasted to a slow halt on the side of the road. The hum of the engine faded into nothing, leaving me in the oppressive silence of the night. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I maintained my truck religiously. It had never given me trouble before. Hoping it was just a fluke, I turned the key. Nothing, just the awful clicking sound of a dead engine. Great. I flicked on the hazard lights and stepped out of the cab. The night air hit me like a wall of heat, even though the sun had long set. Desert nights are supposed to be cool, but something about this air felt wrong. I popped the hood and grabbed my flashlight, shining it over the engine. I'm no mechanic, but I know enough to spot obvious issues. Everything looked fine. No leaks, no visible damage. But no matter how many times I tried, the engine wouldn't turn over. I grabbed the CB radio. Breaker 19, anyone out there? I'm stuck on the side of the highway. Rig's dead. Anyone nearby? Static. I tried again, louder this time. My unease was growing. Come on, someone's got to be out there. I could use some help. Nothing. No distant voice. No sign of another driver. Just static. My phone didn't have a signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk to. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. No way to fix the truck, and no one to call. A shiver climbed the back of my neck. That creeping sense that something wasn't right. I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed headlights in the distance, faint but growing closer. Relief flooded through me. Maybe another trucker, someone who could help or give me a ride. As the vehicle got closer, I saw it was an old, beat-up pickup truck. It rolled to a stop a few yards ahead of my rig. A man stepped out, tall, lanky, his clothes worn and dusty like he'd been on the road for days. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. Something about him immediately put me on edge. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. But what choice did I have? "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "My truck broke down. Not sure what the problem is, it just died." The man nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward my rig. "Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated again, but nodded. "Sure, go ahead." He walked over to the truck, his movements slow and deliberate. My unease grew. He didn't ask any questions, didn't seem all that interested in the engine. Instead, he just stood there, peering under the hood with his back turned to me. Minutes passed. "See anything wrong?" I asked, breaking the silence. He didn't respond at first. When he finally turned, there was an odd look in his eyes. "Looks like you're in trouble," he said, almost amused. "But I can help. I've got a place not far from here. Tools and such. We can tow your rig and get you fixed up." My gut screamed at me to say no. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I think I'll just wait for a tow." The man's expression darkened slightly. For a moment, he didn't move. "You sure?" he asked, stepping closer. "Could be hours before anyone else comes by." My heart was pounding, but I forced another smile. "I'm sure. Thanks anyway." He stared at me for what felt like forever. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his truck. But he didn't leave. His engine idled, headlights glaring at my rig. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and waited. He didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, his truck lurched forward and pulled up alongside mine. My stomach twisted as I saw his silhouette through the window. He rolled it down, leaning out. "You sure you don't want that help, buddy?" Panic surged. I gripped the tire iron under my seat, my hands trembling. He got out of his truck, leaving the engine running, and started walking toward me. Slow, deliberate steps. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. Desperation clawed at me. He reached the door and knocked. "Open up," he said, his voice cold. "Let's have a talk." Then, in the distance, I heard another engine. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. The man froze, glaring toward the approaching vehicle. Without another word, he walked back to his truck and sped off. The new trucker pulled up behind me, a fellow long-haul driver. When I told him what happened, he stayed with me until help arrived. That night, I learned a hard lesson. Not everyone offering help has good intentions. Even now, when I'm on a lonely stretch of road, I keep driving. I never stop for strangers. Sometimes, the people who seem the most helpful are the ones you need to fear the most. For close to 2 decades, I've lived on the road as a long-haul trucker. You get used to the solitude, the long hours, the isolation. There's a rhythm to it, a peace that settles over you when it's just you, your rig, and the highway stretching endlessly into the horizon. I've driven through blistering summer heat and bone-chilling snowstorms, down back roads that vanish from the map and into towns so small they barely exist. But in all that time, only one night stays with me, vivid and raw, haunting my thoughts every time I pull off the highway into the stillness of the night. It was late October, during a cross-country haul from Arizona to Georgia. I'd just crossed the New Mexico border when the exhaustion hit, a heavy, insistent wave that blurred my vision and slowed my reflexes. After nearly 11 hours on the road, my body screamed for rest. You know that feeling? When the steering wheel feels distant, your grip loosens, and you catch yourself nodding off? That dangerous dance with sleep. I couldn't keep going. It wasn't safe. The highway stretched empty for miles. No major truck stops nearby, just a desolate expanse of asphalt and desert. I told myself to hang on, keep an eye out for a rest stop, somewhere to park for a few hours, recharge before pushing through the next leg of the trip. When I spotted the weathered green sign that read, "Rest stop 2 miles," relief washed over me. Perfect timing, I thought. I slowed as I approached the exit, taking the narrow off-ramp to the rest area. The lot came into view, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp that threw long, uneasy shadows across cracked pavement. It was deserted, practically lifeless except for 2 semi-trucks parked at the far end. Their cabs were dark, drivers likely asleep or long gone. The building housing the restrooms was worn down, its paint peeling in jagged strips. Something about the place didn't sit right, but I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I parked near the middle of the lot, not too close to the other trucks, but not too isolated either. The sound of my rig's engine shutting down left a hollow silence in its wake. No hum of traffic in the distance, no rustle of wind, just oppressive stillness. I grabbed my thermos and took a swig of lukewarm coffee, letting its bitter taste ground me. But that uneasy feeling crept up my spine anyway, stubborn and unshakable. Before settling in for some sleep, I decided to stretch my legs and hit the restroom. With my flashlight in hand, I stepped out into the cool night air, boots crunching on the asphalt. The restroom building looked even worse up close. The door hung awkwardly on rusted hinges, graffiti scrawled in crude shapes along the walls. The moment I opened the door, I was hit with the sharp, musty stench of neglect. My flashlight revealed cracked tiles and grime streaked across the sinks. One of the mirrors was shattered, its jagged edges reflecting fragmented light. I quickly did my business, eager to leave, when a sound froze me in place, soft footsteps. At first, I thought they might be inside the building, a faint scuff like someone dragging a shoe over the floor. Then I realized they were outside, circling the building, slow, intentional. My heart hammered in my chest as I finished up and edged toward the door, straining to hear more. Silence greeted me again. Steeling my nerves, I stepped outside. The parking lot was the same as before. Dim light, empty spaces, the distant hulks of the two silent trucks at the far end. No one in sight, just the eerie quiet. I scanned the area with my flashlight but saw nothing unusual. Feeling foolish for my overreaction, I started back toward my truck. Then I saw him. A man stood near one of the picnic tables, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. His hood was pulled low, shadowing his face. I stopped mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. He wasn't there before, I was sure of it. I swept the lot before going into the restroom. Where had he come from? He didn't move, didn't call out. He just stood there, utterly still, facing my direction. My flashlight wavered in my trembling hand as I tried to get a better look, but his features stayed obscured. Something about the way he stood, rigid, waiting, unnerved me more than his sudden appearance. Trying to act natural, I turned and walked briskly to my truck. Once inside, I locked the doors and settled into the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the figure through the window. But when I glanced back, he was gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, half expecting him to reappear. I told myself he was just another traveler, maybe another trucker killing time at the rest, but that didn't explain the way he'd stood there, watching, waiting. I settled into my sleeper cab, determined to rest. As I turned off the light, the darkness seemed heavier than usual, pressing down like a weight. Sleep was elusive. My mind kept returning to that hooded figure, replaying every unsettling detail. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. This time, right outside my truck. Deliberate, measured, crunching slowly across the pavement. My breath hitched. I grabbed the flashlight, aiming it through the window, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, circling the truck. Then they stopped. A soft knock came at the door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze. A second knock, louder this time, shattered the silence. My phone showed no signal, and the figures remained obscured. Each sound from outside made my gut scream with primal fear. It wasn't until another vehicle's bright headlights swept through the lot that my unseen stalkers scattered, dissolving into the desert darkness. To this day, I hear knocks in my nightmares. I've been driving trucks for a long time, crossing state lines and navigating more highways than I can even count. I've seen a lot of things out there, mostly at night, when the roads are quiet and the world feels like it's slipping into some kind of other place, especially in the Southwest. There's something about the desert that's just different. The emptiness, the sky stretching out forever, the way the wind seems to carry whispers. I can't explain it, but it's a different kind of place. A different kind of quiet. And I've seen people out there too, weird figures just standing in the desert, looking lost, or maybe just watching. Sometimes I swear I've seen things moving in the shadows, things that shouldn't be moving. Once, I even saw a line of people crawling on their hands and knees along the road, a whole procession of them, stretching out for what felt like miles. That was strange, yeah. But none of it compares to what happened that one morning near the border. The morning that changed everything. This happened around 2010. I was running a route along the southwestern border, hugging Mexico for a good 100 miles. This stretch wasn't exactly peaceful. Cartel activity was rampant, and any driver making this route knew the risks. You didn't go in blind. Most of us used CB radios to keep each other posted on what was going on ahead, sometimes even mile by mile. It was like a little network of survival. Sharing warnings. Roadblock at mile marker 230. Keep an eye on those headlights behind you, they've been following for 3 exits. Usually, it was quiet, static and long stretches of nothing. But every so often, there'd be chatter about suspicious activity. Trucks with their lights off, following too close. Cars speeding by without headlights. Or even the occasional shootout that you'd hear about secondhand. But on that particular night, it was dead still. I wasn't even listening to the radio. I'd made this drive so many times by then that I'd stopped even thinking about it. It was just another route on another night. I had my usual pullouts that I liked to use. Spots off the radar where I could rest up without drawing too much attention. Not exactly legal parking, but when you're dealing with potential cartel trouble, you want to be invisible. One of my go-to spots was off a dirt road, down a wash between a couple of old leaning billboards and into a gully where my truck fit just right, hidden completely from the highway. It was Arizona, middle of nowhere. The stars were bright overhead, a perfect place to grab some sleep. I pulled in and shut the engine down, ate a quick dinner from the cooler. The air was still, and the night was quiet except for the occasional breeze rustling through the desert. I watched the stars for a bit, letting my mind drift, then climbed into the bunk and settled down for the night. I must have fallen asleep watching a movie, because the next thing I remember was being jolted awake by a loud thud. Something hit my truck, hard. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, and listened. Footsteps. Outside. I moved to the front and slid into the driver's seat, peering out through the windshield. It was dark, too dark to see anything but vague shapes outside. Then the footsteps stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The desert went quiet again. I told myself it was probably an animal, a coyote maybe. Then I climbed back into the bunk. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a scream. It sounded like it came from way out in the desert. Really far off, a long, drawn-out scream, like somebody was in real trouble. Then another, and another. Each time, it seemed like it was getting closer. Like whoever or whatever was out there was slowly moving toward me. I sat up again, heart pounding, and listened. After the screams, I heard voices, too many to count, overlapping, talking over each other. I couldn't make out any of the words. They were far away, distorted by the wind or the emptiness of the desert. But the tone of them, it sounded desperate, begging. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Somehow, that silence was worse, like the desert had just swallowed everything up. I don't know why I did it, but I reached up and flipped on the high beams, flashed them 3 times into the night. Maybe I thought it would help whoever was out there find their way. Maybe it was just instinct. The lights cut through the darkness. But I couldn't see anything, just the empty desert stretching out in front of me. I reached for my CB, heart still racing, and called out to anybody nearby. After a few seconds of static, a voice crackled back. "Yeah, I hear you," the other driver said. "See anything out there?" "No, but I heard something," I replied. "Screaming, people, it sounds like they're in trouble." The other driver was quiet for a moment. Then in a low voice he responded, "You want to stay put, friend? I just got shot at by some expletive driving without headlights. Barely made it out myself. There's cars racing up and down the highway like they're looking for something or someone. Stay hidden. Whatever you heard, it ain't good." That was definitely not what I wanted to hear. I signed off, feeling a gnawing dread deep in my gut. I sat there for a few minutes, listening, but the night had gone dead quiet again. Eventually, I climbed back into my bunk, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept replaying those screams, those voices, the eerie silence that followed. Morning came early, and I wasted no time getting ready to leave. I wanted to be on the road and far away from that spot as quickly as possible. But when I stepped out of the cab, I froze. About 20 feet from my truck was a puddle of dark blood soaking into the sand. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just blood. The air felt heavier, and that silence? It lingered, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, watching and waiting. Whatever happened out there, I still don't know. But I do know I'll never park there again. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear those voices in the wind.